Hey there, I'm Dr. Jill Wener. I am a physician, an author, a meditation teacher, tapping practitioner, and an aspiring anti-racist, which requires constant self-examination and learning and willingness to be wrong. And I am so excited to have Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang here with me, who is so many things to me. She's a friend. She is the creator of the Mindful Healthcare Collective, which I have been a part of since the beginning of COVID, which we'll talk about in the actual interview. She's a award-winning pulmonologist, and she is an Asian American woman activist who is just so incredible and such a creator of many things and a bringer together of people. So, Ni-Cheng, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Yay. So I guess to start, I mean, you and I have been having these conversations in our one-on-one and in our group about the way that I think there's like a personal aspect of the way that you're experiencing racism, particularly during COVID. And then there's your bigger kind of activism piece of how you started to get more pulled in finding your voice. So I'd love to hear from you what led you to getting more vocal and active in the space. And if you are open to sharing some of the experiences that you've had during COVID or before, particularly like, I don't know, I guess I'm going to reframe my question a little bit, and that like, I'm Jewish and I have experienced some persecution, and I also know that it's not the same as anti-Blackness in America. I think what you have experienced is probably a lot more than what I have experienced, but how you hold space for what you've experienced and for other types of racism in our country, if that makes sense.
Sure. I'm happy to share, just starting off with the recent events of the COVID pandemic, in that being a Chinese Taiwanese American pulmonologist, where the virus itself was given like an ethnicity. Yeah. And I know that that's not necessarily unique in history in terms of labeling pandemics, et cetera, but the way that it was used was that this ethnicity became weaponized, and then it became weaponized against like all Asian Americans, in the way that especially our past political administration was, for instance, using it. And so in that context, treating patients on the front lines and kind of being on the receiving end of microaggressions, that I name microaggressions because I truly doubt that there was harm intended from at least a particularly poignant example that I'm going to share with you, is that one of my patients asked me basically how much I thought the Chinese government owed the United States because of the pandemic, and to which I was in a state of shock. I had to kind of ground into my mindfulness practices in order to not launch into a full out verbal attack of hurt and probably shame mixed in there, of anger, with my patient. And basically coming out from that, realizing that perhaps he didn't see me as Chinese Taiwanese American, even though my name, the way that I look, would be pretty obvious. And so I couched that experience as an opportunity for me to bring in my mindfulness practice, bringing in the curiosity piece of like, where is this question coming from? What's the intent of the question? What were objectives? And then also honoring, like, at the same time, the hurt that I was feeling, the anger that I was feeling, very much so like in my chest at the time of the encounter, but then really being authentic about the curiosity of like, what do you mean by that? Just the question of getting better clarity about his intent. And I think that from that place of curiosity, that in and of itself, and really taking the time to listen, helped in the moment diffuse a lot of the anger and the hurt that I was feeling in that particular moment, so that I could respond in a way that was compassionate and yet authentic, and also like challenging of his question and his implied assumptions of what that question was meaning, um, in a way that was more skillful as opposed to reactionary and volatile.
Yeah.
So
How did it work out?
I think it worked out as best as it could have, because then I used facts to continue the conversation, and the conversation and the tension kind of diffused after that.
Oh, good. That's so impressive. Yeah, I think there's very few people who are going to take that moment and have that mindful presence to say, I'm a little curious about that question and tell me what you mean. But that's such a great approach. And I think missing from so much, I'm air quoting dialogue here for podcast listeners who can't see this on video, like dialogue that's not really dialogue. And it sounds like you actually engaged in a authentic dialogue with him about it.
And it's not to say that like the anger and the hurt weren't there. It's more that there was holding space for all of it, right? Like I could hold space for curiosity at the same time as honoring the anger and the hurt that I was feeling, and still feel to this day about that question. That's okay.
Yeah. So how have you, because I've been able to see from a close distance, you're getting more and more involved in the anti-racism and social justice space, particularly within the medical community. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that's come to be and what kind of work you're doing in that space?
It really, I think, heightened because of the over 100% increase in Asian American Pacific Islander hate crimes that had been reported across many major cities in the United States. So just from that fact, my response was that I can no longer remain silent about what was going on. So interestingly, when I first came to the United States as an immigrant at the age of 5, and after reading the book Minor Feelings by Kathy Hong Park, there is this desire that I recognize in my youth to blend in with white culture, that I didn't want to be seen as an outsider, even though like my skin and the way that I talked when I was going into kindergarten certainly prevented me from doing. I was very much other, quote unquote, and also for the podcasters in air quotes. But then, and I think to a certain extent, that went on through childhood and into high school. But it wasn't until college that there was a newfound appreciation and newfound recognition in the beauty that lies within diversity, of kind of owning my culture and owning my Chinese Taiwanese Americanness in a way that's unique from being identified as strictly American or strictly Chinese/Taiwanese. That I'm kind of this amalgamation of the varied cultures from my ancestors, my parents, the way that I was raised, and then being embedded into American culture. It wasn't until college that I think acknowledged that. But even more recently, though, the atrocities that have been committed haven't been highlighted in my life in the way that it has been this past year, to the point where there was kind of a tipping point where I had to, or at least I felt like I had to get over my discomfort about speaking up and speaking out and really sharing with others about what was happening elsewhere, not just locally within my own microcosm of a life, but also beyond that. That knowing that I had to speak out for the sake of communicating facts about what was happening, and how injustice was more pervasive than people had potentially originally imagined, especially amongst Asian American Pacific Islanders, just how wrong it was. And so I think from an alignment standpoint, touching in with my own desire to bring compassion to other human beings, this was kind of my way of doing that, in spreading what I saw as injustices to people who would be willing to listen. And then also like speaking about my truth and what my family and I have gone through too, as a example. So that's kind of been the process. I'm still like in the discomfort of it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely recognize that, and and finding myself in my zone of discomfort when it comes to this, but in a good way.
Yeah.
In that there's definitely capacity for growth, and there is capacity for me to be the change I want to see, however minute or big the impacts might be in this arena right now for me.
One of the things that Maisha talks about a lot in the work that we do together is she's like, and for anyone listening who doesn't know Maisha, Dr. Maisha Claiborne, she's a Black woman, and she's my business partner for Conscious Anti-Racism. She's like, this is uncomfortable for me too. I don't enjoy talking about because she's like, these are my traumas. These are the traumas of our people. No one wants to go out there. I mean, some people do, I shouldn't say that, but like her point is that like, it's not easy to share these personal injuries, these personal traumas, even if it's teaching and making a bigger impact. It's never easy, and it doesn't really ever stop feeling uncomfortable, which is like, I guess, good and bad. It's that feeling like we're all in this together. It's uncomfortable for all of us. And also, that's part of the process, and recognizing the pain of what people who have been marginalized have been through. So thank you for bringing that in here and for naming that. How has the response been in your family? I'm just curious, like, is there any like, ooh, don't speak up, or don't, how has that landed with your family?
My parents have been really on also somewhat the receiving end of some of the anti-racism over the last year.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I don't even know that they know that I'm necessarily speaking out about it in this way, largely on like social media and having written articles about it. Though, and I'm not sure why that is. I think part of it is that they don't know, they're not in the audience of where I'm usually publicizing or sharing my story. So that's part of it. My brother and my sister-in-law and my husband are tremendously supportive of speaking my truth, and I think they're welcoming of it. And yet at the same time, I also think that they're also not sure what to do with it too, because it's a new frontier for all of us. Yeah. And so we'll see what happens if they want me to censor or any aspect of that. But thus far, they've all been quite supportive. And the other recognition is that, like, if I share from a place of personal experience in my story, I also would challenge that, like, it's my story to tell. And so who is anyone else to tell me what I was or was not supposed to share or feel during a particular part of my life that was particularly uncomfortable too.
Yeah. How how has it been like, I feel like you've gotten a lot of really great opportunities to speak out. You had an article published on Kevin MD, and within your California Thoracic Society, I believe, is where you're doing some of this work as well. If I'm mistaken, please correct me. How do you feel like it's being received on that end?
Interestingly, about that Kevin MD article, it was published before the mass murder that happened in Georgia that really like galvanized a lot of the AAPI anti-racist movement of this past year. And so it was interesting in that I had published that beforehand, but then it became relevant even more so like later on during the year. And so, yes, definitely tremendous support and acknowledgement and resonated a lot with other Asian American professionals, especially Asian American physicians. So that story that I published definitely had much broader reach than I had anticipated it would have upon original publication.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the Mindfulness for Healthcare Summit that was organized by mindful.org, I had an opportunity to be part of an interview on mindful anti-racism and shared my stories there as well. So that was an unexpected kind of opportunity to speak my truth and have a platform in sharing, also within the constructs of medical practice and how systemic racism and health disparities are so prevalent, especially in my field of practicing medicine and pulmonary medicine, notably as well. So a lot of welcome support there as well. And also just so much gratitude for being sometimes like the only East Asian physician on X, Y, and Z panel that's speaking out on this as well. So recognizing that I am sometimes alone in being the lone voice on a panel or at a conference, but knowing that I am okay with that, however uncomfortable, because if not me, then who is the question that I ask myself too. And then through the California Thoracic Society, really excited about having you also be part of our expert panel. Through American Thoracic Society, I do want to give some kudos to how much programming there was this past year at the virtual international conference on health disparities and the programming around that topic. So so it's been a long time coming that international conferences, national organizations in medicine have protected time to finally share about these uncomfortable and yet like very necessary topics in anti-racism and health disparities.
It's so interesting to see the like beauty of Zoom and how it's kind of reframed or redesigned or reimagined how we convene and how we come together, and all these wonderful things. You can throw them together in a week or with a month's notice because people aren't having to fly out, and you can, you know, get these amazing people together that maybe would take 6 months or 9 months to get all those people in the same space. So that's been, I think, one of the really interesting things. I was just talking to the chief of hospital medicine at Emory, and he was saying that they are probably not going to go back to live grand rounds because, and for anyone listening who's not medical, grand rounds is like for each major department, like surgery, internal medicine, pediatrics, once a week, generally there's like a big lecture that's kind of cutting edge or some topic that's beyond just like medical knowledge. It's something that's new or medical culture. And so he said they have, you know, hundreds of people coming now, whereas before there would be 35 people that would show up live. So they may not even go back. Have you experienced similar things in your medical communities?
In the California Thoracic Society, because the in-person meeting in Carmel is almost like a historic structure that's been set into the backbone of the society,
Mm-hmm.
that I definitely miss the in-person conference, but we quickly pivoted to a virtual platform because of that. And in terms of attendees, I'm not sure what the numbers ended up being, but definitely having online capability for connectedness is a silver lining for COVID for sure.
Mm-hmm.
As experienced by like the Mindful Healthcare Collective, like we can put on events, multiple events during the week that you've contributed to and leading as well, with an audience that we otherwise probably would not have been able to convene on such short notice from like
Yeah.
all across the world, really.
Let's talk a little bit about that. It's not a specific anti-racism venture, but it's so worth mentioning because what you've put together is astounding. I mean, if you think about what when we've done it together, but you created the space. So can you talk a little bit about the Mindful Healthcare Collective and how you like how the idea came to you and put how you put it together and how you did so, I think, in a very mindful, deliberate way. But what was that process like for you?
So the Mindful Healthcare Collective was born out of knowing the burnout statistics of physicians even before the pandemic, of 40 to 50%, depending on the subspecialty, of physicians being burnt out. And knowing that the pandemic would most likely, at the time there was not any data, and the data is now just starting to kind of trickle in about burnout during the pandemic. But knowing that the extreme amount of stress that healthcare professionals were going to be facing going into the pandemic was going to significantly impact our well-being, it was born out of the desire to reduce suffering for the healthcare community. And I knew I wasn't able to do it alone. And so I started asking really friends and colleagues that I knew who had done really great work in relieving suffering, who had additional training beyond that of their medical licenses in, for you, your emotional freedom technique and all of the anti-racism work that you've been doing, was particularly attractive for me in thinking about a broader scope of providing different types of resources. And so not just mindfulness and not just yoga for the larger community. And so thank you so much for all of your contributions to the Mindful Healthcare Collective and the programming. And then in thinking about other evidence-based resources to provide a community in a time where the pandemic can be very isolating.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very important for me to have these live Zoom events where there could be gatherings and have leaders that had additional training to facilitate and hold space really for all the suffering that was going on and still is to a certain extent, but definitely probably less so than when we were in the thick of it.
Yeah. Well, there's like the deceleration factor now. It's like everyone was in stress mode, like fight or flight, let's get through this. And then it's like, what just happened? And by just, I mean over the last 14, 15 months, but like even starting to process what we've been through, I think that the collective is even, I won't say even more important, but just as important now as people are starting to recognize the impact and get back to, we're doing all the air quotes today, get back to quote unquote normal, but not feeling normal. Like we aren't the same humans that we were 15 months ago, and nothing is the same. And how do you go back into the world and like be like, I go sit outside on patios now, and I drink beer on patios, and I just go into restaurant, like how do you go back to that, carrying this extra like piece of us that COVID has created within all of us? It's a very complex process. So I think it's really good that we're continuing to do the work.
Yeah, it's super jarring, and a lot of mixed emotions. A lot of judgment has been coming up for me as we kind of re-emerge from the home quarantine and the stricter isolation measures. Now vaccines are out as well. So yeah, I am so glad for the state of things, and yet I can still notice the conflicting emotions that arise when I do re-enter society in ways that I hadn't in the last 14 months.
Yeah. How do you use, so I did not mention this explicitly, and I think you've mentioned it, but Ni-Cheng is also a mindfulness-based stress reduction instructor, an excellent one. And I wonder how you use mindfulness. You've mentioned it like in your conversation with your patient, but how do you use your mindfulness practice in your own, within the context of anti-racism or social justice, within your own lived experience, and then with the broader picture, and not just how do you use it, but how do you see it being used and the benefits of it?
So mindfulness is paying attention on purpose to the present moment without any judgment. Another way to think about mindfulness is training our brains to be in the same place at the same time as our bodies. And so from being on the receiving end of microaggressions and anti-Asian racism, having had that foundation of tuning into my body when there's discomfort or stress or an anxiety provoking situation, that definitely has been a very obvious way to use mindfulness when dealing with racism, has been to ground into the body sensations of discomfort. And so that like spreads beyond that of racist discomfort, that goes to all different forms of stress and anxiety of life in general. But I think it's particularly helpful in the anti-racism arena because we can really be intentional about pausing and checking in with our body sensations so that we can honor what we're actually feeling from a physiologic level, which then lends itself to like an exercise of like checking in with what emotions are arising for us, and then what thoughts, in a more objective way, noticing the thoughts that arise about it, realizing that our thoughts are not necessarily true and don't necessarily have to be a trigger for us to spin into over identification of the thoughts and spinning into catastrophizing, for instance. So mindfulness is kind of like a stopgap. It allows us to notice the entire experience just as it is without trying to fight the reality of his existence. So it's kind of slowed things down for me in a lot of different ways, in a healthy way. So first is the noticing the discomfort once you're in it, honoring what your own lived experience of that discomfort is. And then as you honor your lived experience, oftentimes that distance between the situation and you can create the space for you to respond in a more aligned way.
Rather than reacting.
Yes.
Like with your patient, for example, you could have just bitten his head off and been like, you are racist and you are this and you are that and you have no idea what I've been through. But like, and that would have been probably justified. But is like, what did you say? The more intentional response, or you had a word of aligned, I think is what you said. Like, what is the response that's more aligned with how you want to show up with your patient without shoving away your feelings? And I think that's the important thing that mindfulness can really help with, is like I'm feeling this and I'm honoring it. I'm not pretending that I'm not mad or pretending that everything's okay. And also holding in the other hand, I can choose not to let this consume me right now. Does that sound
That's a great summary, Jill.
So it's so fascinating. Okay, I have a question. Model minority. That's something I've heard you use that term, and I've heard that term used from a lot of our other colleagues who are not, okay, air quotes again, but we don't need those air quotes this time, who are not white passing, who are not white in this world, but who are also not Black. And I guess, I don't know what other minorities are considered model minority, but how do you find I'm curious as to A, your reaction to that term, B, how do you use mindfulness to navigate that, to navigate when you're, like you said, you didn't want to be different. You were not wanting to have, you wanted to blend in. So do you still have those tendencies in you now? And do you use mindfulness / how do you use mindfulness to recognize that and move away from it?
So the term model minority, I learned about its historic origins from the book that I mentioned, Minor Feelings. And it comes from some of the immigration laws that have been passed in this country that kind of handpicked Asian immigrants that were skilled to come to the US. So they were, in essence, embodying like a skill or a craft that could potentially make the US a better place. And hence the term model from that. And then minority, because we're not white, we're not the majority population in the US. In terms of that terminology, I think it's really loaded on a lot of different fronts. Growing up pre being an attending physician, doing a lot of my training, yes, there was definitely this desire to blend in and to do the best that I could and to excel and to basically feed into my perfectionistic tendencies, so much to the point where I burned myself out. And also then I had cancer in my second year of pulmonary critical care fellowship. And so it was with that life-threatening diagnosis and the treatment course of which that I started to kind of let go of having to put so much pressure on myself to be the model, to be or strive to be perfect. That, and really it's this past year of learning more and more about Asian American history and Asian American racism that I realize my preferred and probably healthier way of being is to show up in my authentic state. And that is as an Asian American woman professional who's also a mom and a cancer survivor and has other expertise. And knowing that in a lot of the crowds, from professional societies to friend circles, that I would potentially be like the only East Asian person at the table. And rather than blending in like I had wanted to before, almost like a wallflower, and staying silent and almost reinforcing prior stereotypes of East Asian women, I am in some ways bucking that norm now in what I'm doing with speaking out more and being a bit more challenging of some of the prior false beliefs that I used to hold. So there's almost like an accountability of like, if I feel discomfort in a situation that's happening where I feel like there's some sort of injustice, I'm much more outspoken about it as opposed to before, where there would be an automatic tendency for self-blame, and introspection of like, what did I do wrong, or how can I make this better? And now I'm much more, comparatively speaking, much more outspoken, even if it knowingly bucks the norm, but in like a good way, because I realize that if I don't speak up, then no one from my demographic is necessarily going to have a voice, especially because I'm the only person at the table
Right.
of my particular demographic too. So yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, but one that might be a lifelong journey into showing up in my authentic Chinese, Taiwanese, American way, both in the US and also when I visit East Asia as well. Because automatically, even in when I visit my my home country of my home of Taiwan, that automatically when I walk into a store or a restaurant, like people know I'm not from there, even though my skin color, my hair color looks the same as them. So I'm like not Chinese Taiwanese enough there.
That's fascinating. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I blend in, but apparently I carry myself differently just by the way I walk.
Oh my gosh. So how do you use I know you do use it, so I don't even want to say do you use it, but like how does mindfulness, because I'll like for my own personal example, I've noticed my separation, my distancing myself from my own religion of Judaism. It's not a race, but it's a very cultural identity, and it does come with some features that a lot of Jewish people have, particularly like American Jews. So I've noticed within myself, and as I've learned more about oppression and white supremacy culture, that I have internalized white supremacy culture against my own outward appearance of it, or wanting to be connected to it. And that's part of it for me. It's one part of it. And recognizing that within myself and being like, oh, that's what that discomfort was, or that's what those feelings are. How do you use your mindfulness practice to like catch yourself falling into old habits? Is that something that still comes up, or how does your mindfulness inform your awareness of, I have to speak up, I'm not going to be what everyone expects me to be?
I think it's in noticing the discomfort when I notice there's a misalignment, or when there's like an injustice that is taking place. Or perhaps it's something as simple as I can offer a different perspective or a different question about that particular situation. Like, for instance, in committee work that I'm part of, there definitely is the discomfort, but it's in recognizing that there is a initial misalignment, and then the discomfort of the physical sensation of me having to speak up about it.
Mm.
So mindfulness, I think, has been the vehicle by which that I can hold space for all of that.
Yeah.
That's how I think mindfulness shows up for me in the way that I'm a bit more outspoken now. That there's space for all of the discomfort as I'm kind of growing into my voice, and even if people don't necessarily value my opinion or my insights, I'm gonna say what I think in that context anyway.
I love that. I love that. That's perfect, because you're like checking. It's like all about your authenticity and your integrity and your values and how you're going to show up, and that's an internal locus of validation, I guess, rather than doing it to make a certain impression. So I think that's so much more authentic.
I think that's a great point about validation. I think mindfulness has been really helpful for me for my own struggles with validation of my own lived experience, and therefore my right to kind of share it.
Can you
So
talk
in terms
about
of
that?
like, yeah, so in terms of like the noticing of wanting to blend in and get quote unquote white validation, like white acceptance, right? Growing up, that somehow made me okay. And then separating that as the years passed, and really kind of coming into my own and kind of cutting the strings of needing external validation as much. I'll say it's a work in progress, but I definitely feel like I've come a long way over the years with regards to that. And then part of it also is that there's this sheer exhaustion that comes with a need for external validation, especially if it's an external, like white based validation. That like absolve myself of the need to do all of that, and like give myself the freedom, the breath, literally, of coming into my own, using my own internal validation as a compass rather than external sources. So I think it's in the recognition of that, and then all of the discomfort and all of the baggage that comes with it, where mindfulness has been helpful in holding space for that in a very non-judgmental way, because I can definitely beat myself up about all of that, wanting and needing external validation, but I choose not to.
Like over and over again, it's like a constant. I have to continue to choose not to feed into that. I've been thinking a lot about radical self-love recently, and I've started reading The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. Sorry. And just what that means, and not having to apologize for anything about ourselves, and thinking about like what is that thing we're comparing ourselves to? Where does it come from? Whose voice is it? How much power have we given it? And does it deserve that power? And like that goes from external appearance of ethnicity and race to internal and then external appearance of body size or able-bodiedness, and then internal things as well. So it's fascinating to me. How do you see, I know that self-compassion and self-love are a huge part of mindfulness. How do you see that playing in?
Constant work in progress, because with that need for external validation in my not so distant past, there was the tendency for like self-flagellation, right? So like being hard on oneself, which in the past I thought would translate to increasing my capacity to be better or to have better academic excellence and achieve more, etc. But when in actuality it was counterproductive to wellness and counterproductive to authenticity. And so self-compassion and self-love have, I think, finally made its way into more of my day-to-day out of necessity from my cancer journey. And it's always a constant work in progress, like decades worth of not prioritizing oneself. It's hard to change.
Yeah.
But so important. Like, I think self-compassion and self-love, they need to, like, the medical schools need to incorporate that in the teaching of medicine much more than what we got.
Right. I'm smiling because I'm like, when I was a med student, if anyone tried to talk to me about meditation or self-love, I was like, like So there's just like something in that mindset of like, but but I think that culture is changing too, because now I've turned into the person that I used to kind of mock, or I'm the one that's like, we need to meditate to feel better and take care of ourselves. And I was just like, let me take my test and let me go get drunk and let me like study for 15 hours a day and still think it's not enough and feel bad about myself. And then that's all I need is just to go get drunk. And that was absolutely, so yes, we need so much more of that. And we need it to be a part of our culture rather than just like a way for it to be heard also, I think.
It's really nice and relieving to see that many medical schools have embodied mindfulness as part of their curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me wonder like what kind of physician or how much less I might have suffered had mindfulness been introduced
Mm-hmm.
into med school curriculum earlier on. But now there is kind of like a tipping point, especially related to physician wellness, coming hot off the heels of the pandemic. I mean, the ongoing pandemic, really. There's this attunement that needs to happen in the way medicine is practiced in the US. There's a heightened awareness about its importance.
Mm-hmm.
And so for that, I'm grateful that that can be construed as a silver lining. And yet knowing that there's so much work to be done about changing the culture of medicine.
Yeah, oh gosh, yes, in so many ways. I think a huge realization for me at some point in the last few years was the healthcare system is just as racist as all of the other systems and just as harmful, in so many different ways. So, so much there that can be worked on. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I'd love for you to share what you've got going on now, places people can find you, follow you. Please tell us about your podcast and anything else that people who are falling in love with you can pick up more of what you are putting down.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Jill. You can find me on my website, awakenbreath.org. And I will be teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction again come fall of 2021. And I also have a CME accredited mindful physician course that will be launching again in August. Other ways that you can find me, I am also co-host of the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney. So we have new episodes every week on Sundays. So hope that you'll find me there. And if you're a healthcare professional, please sign up and join us over at the Mindful Healthcare Collective. We have a website by the namesake, mindfulhealthcarecollective.com, that you can sign up for free. Thanks.
Awesome. And also Facebook too. You can find that on the Facebook group as well, the Mindful Healthcare Collective. And are you social media? Is there any social media that you want to mention?
Oh yeah, Instagram, I'm NC Liang MD. And then on Twitter, I'm Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
Okay. Is there a hyphen in Ni-Cheng in your Twitter?
No.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I'll put all this stuff, all the Minor Feelings book and the link to your Kevin MD article. We'll put all that in the show notes for anyone who is interested, and links to all the social media and websites. So thank you again for joining me. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to speak with you about this topic. And thank you for all the work you do and for being who you are. And have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much for having me.